So we are the last word on Florida.
The last. And we figured out that we are very geographically diverse Floridians. I'm from North Florida, Rebecca from Central Florida, Jennine from South Florida.
Yep.
Now, I don't know what that does, but it is interesting. So we come from different Floridas.
Yeah, and we sat in that order to keep it clear, too.
Yeah.
Definitely
I'm
on
the
purpose.
southernmost. I think it's over there, right? The southernmost point.
You're the southernmost Jennine anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, and we don't have a giant structure here. We're just going to kind of talk, I guess, and have a conversation with you as well. I wanted to kick off by saying, I'm also the oldest, so I'm choosing to be the boss cat for just a minute. But, the different Floridas we come from probably have made us see ourselves as writers of different subjects, different milieu, different sensibilities, but we all have a home that's Florida. It just might mean something different. I'm a product of lots and lots of oak trees, pecan trees, magnolias, things that won't grow here because they need to get cold. And I always wanted to grow things that won't grow in Tallahassee because it gets too cold. But, we all at one point found ourselves looking at our Florida and going, wow, that's weird. I should write about that.
Well, my journey as a Florida writer, I feel like it came to a bit of a climax while I was writing my book, Gator Country, because most of my life as a younger writer, writing fiction and then nonfiction, we were talking about the beautiful scrub landscapes of Central Florida, where we have these one-of-a-kind scrub jays that are very curious, and they'll come look you in the eye like they know what you might be thinking, and that's far from the only interesting animal and far from the only interesting biome there. While I was doing this research, I realized that my home is one of the most biodiverse places in North America. We have scrub and beach and pine uplands, and I could list them all for you, but I'd rather you go explore them because I think it's Florida, but also Central Florida specifically, is one of those places that people tend to ignore in favor of it's just Disney World. But it's not just Disney World. But as a younger writer, I got it into my head that it wasn't interesting, and that I wanted to have grown up in a place that other people thought mattered, and that I got it into my head that it didn't actually matter. And then I had to learn to re-see where I was from to see the beauty of it. And I think that's when I found my voice as a writer, that I could see the things that other people told me weren't there, and sort of export that to the world, like, this is the real Florida. It's beautiful and meaningful, and I hope you see where you're from like that too. So
Yeah, I didn't begin writing about Miami. I grew up specifically in Hialeah. Anybody know Hialeah in the audience? Hialeah, woo, 305. All right. I didn't know much. I wasn't really aware that I was writing about it as a place until I left, and it sort of came from a place of homesickness and nostalgia. I'm now seeing that kind of nostalgia for Miami, excuse me, as almost like a replication of the nostalgia my parents had for a certain version of Cuba. And I've realized that even the version of Miami I'm writing about is not accurate necessarily anymore, and that I still had to come back and do research even about my hometown. That's actually super important to do. That you can, I think a lot of times we feel we're an authority on something, like we have the last word on something because we're from there. We don't realize a lot of the things we don't know about those places, that we substitute our own sense of what the place is and then learn that that's inaccurate. In the book that I have coming out in March on 305, again, because it has to, because it's a Miami book, so it has to come out on 305, right? I had this description of these fountains in Westland Mall. And the book is set in 2017, and when I looked it up, they got rid of those fountains like in 2010, which was probably the last time I was at Westland Mall. So it's still important to find where you're from interesting enough and feel compelled to do your homework on it and to almost see it like a tourist, right? And then incorporate that into your own sense of the place as you're going to write about it.
Yeah, as a nonfiction writer, I always tell my students, you know, one of your jobs, fiction writers do this too, but one of your jobs is to make the familiar strange, to be the outsider that can see the thing that you took for granted just as the way the world was. And it took me a long time to work out that I come from a place that is strange and beautiful, and it has a very, very long history. There is no, I mean, sure, there are a lot of new built things in Florida, and there are a lot of new people in Florida, but Florida itself has had people living here for about 14,000 years. And so new, you know, we are not about new very much in North Florida. We are about old, and I used to be embarrassed by that. My book, Dream State, is a lot about old because my family's been there a long, long, long time. I was talking to Rebecca about this. I think her family may have been here longer, but mine for more than 200 years. And that's, you know, that's something in my family that they celebrated without ever interrogating. And looking into who they were, I mean, I called the book Dream State because they all had this imagined Florida that they were trying to impose on their lives, whether they imagined a paradise or they imagined, you know, being rich people living in a big white columned mansion. They were also highly exploitative. They lived off of land. They cut trees. They grew cotton. They enslaved people. And so instead of finding that, well, that's, you know, sort of mundane, boring old history and it's over now, we don't have to worry about it, I had to dig into that and sort of deal with it. And it's one, I found it absolutely great because I then made myself a stranger to it so I could see it.
I think that's a wonderful way to re-see your own personal history and figure out how you can give that to others as a way to help them re-see not just the place we are and like, what is the sentence? Not just the place we're living in and the place you're describing, but where they're from too. My family, at least part of it, goes way back in Central Florida, back far enough that they're not keeping records. And but for a while, I was very into how long my family had been here, and I was one of those people who always said how many generations it was, and I stopped saying that while I was writing this book because I found so many people who were first-generation Floridians who had done more for the state than I had and my family had than however many generations we've been here. So I think I'm going a little off topic of what you were saying, but I think, to me, I've started interrogating what it means to be a Floridian, and I joke about what it means to be Florida man and Florida woman, because I get asked that all the time, ridiculous questions about Florida man and Florida woman, and I say, doesn't matter who you are or where you're from, if you brandish a baby alligator at the McDonald's drive-through, you are Florida man. But that's the joke. But what I'm really getting at is if you come here and you participate and you're not here to ruin things and pave paradise, but you're here to live your best life and add to our culture and hopefully not brandish baby alligators at McDonald's drive-thrus, but to become impassioned and to find things that you love in the landscape or in the culture or in the people, then, welcome. You can be a Florida person too. Now, completely off topic.
Yeah, I
You can
don't
talk
even
about whatever
know.
you
Like,
want.
Cool. Well, I'm curious. So both of you write nonfiction. I've written a book of nonfiction, and so I know for me, do either of you write in other genres, or like what would compel you to do that? Because
I write fiction too. I started writing nonfiction because I don't know. It seemed like I could make a living at that easier. I don't know, but it turned out to be true. So.
All right, now I have to admit something that I haven't told really anybody. Is that I've been working on a piece of fiction just to see if I could still do it. My master's degree was in fiction. That was a long time ago. Yes, I hear gasps of horror. But yeah, I wanted to just, it's fun to make things up, I discover. In nonfiction and in journalism, we frown on that, and as we should. But it is great to try something else. And this might be a disaster, but I enjoy the hell out of it. So I'm seeing what I can see. And it's not, if it's ever a book, it won't be a Florida book exactly. But it is about someone from Florida.
wait, so then why isn't it a Florida book? Like, in your
Well,
mind?
because the person lives in another country. But yeah, okay, so it's a Florida book.
You
Sorry.
can take the person out of Florida.
But you can't take the Florida out of the human, can you?
So what makes something a Florida book? Does it have to be set here?
What do you think, Jennine?
I don't know if it has to be set here. I think I've tried with my first novel, which was my second book. My first book is called How to Leave Hialeah, which is about leaving. And I was like, yeah, that's it. I never need to write about South Florida again. And then I wrote a novel where the main character leaves and moves to New York, not New York City, but upstate New York. And then the novel is just like, and then she goes back, and now we're back. It just kept sort of pulling me home. And so then I tried writing nonfiction. Again, I was living in a place where I really didn't feel at home, and then found myself writing about Disney World. I'm one of those people, I'm a first-generation Floridian, and guilty of like all of Central Florida, like most folks from Miami, like that's Disney. Like it's not Orlando, it's not Kissimmee, it's like, oh, you're going to Disney? Like even if it's like, we're going to Winter Park, like that's Disney, like it's just shorthand. So I apologize here for that.
I forgive you.
Yeah,
Okay.
but I wrote an essay about how growing up going to Disney World so much affected my imagination. And when I would go out, I'm one of those people who's like mostly afraid of nature and then tried to be a nature person. And then when I got to nature, such as it is, I was like, that looks like Thunder Mountain in the ride. And this smells like Pirates of the Caribbean here. Like I realized that my touchstones for the natural world were all Disney related, and I still find myself doing it and try not to, but it's just, I think it's a consequence of being a Floridian and growing up here. And so then I just abandoned that idea of trying to leave it as subject matter. And this next book is just so South Florida. And so I was like, I'm going to put it's Scarface meets Moby Dick. And I was like, the Scarface part is very Miami. The Moby Dick it's that expansive nature. I'm trying like every other chapter is a short essay on like the birds of Miami-Dade County, of which I know none of them. So one of them is like Sebastian the ibis, which is the mascot of UM, right? And I was like, that's a bird, right? He might be the most Miami bird if you think about it. So there's like a whole like rant about that. And so I don't know what's next. My hope is that I somehow, I don't know, I didn't purge it, but we'll see where it goes. But what makes something a Florida book is there's some sensibility about it. I think setting a book in Florida can make it a Florida book. I think if the writer is from Florida, that can do it too.
Or if someone just cares enough to delve in, and as Rebecca was saying, you don't have to be from here, you don't have to have any kinfolk here, you can be anybody. I mean, my encounters, say, with Sebastian the ibis, a bird that
Probably the most hated bird for you.
No. No, I'm afraid I saw Sebastian get kind of beat up one time, the FSU Florida State game. Another one of the ways that I embarrass myself in public is to say that I am a lifelong addict of college football. And I became so obsessed with how strange it is once I realized it was strange. I mean, why are there majorettes? There are no reason to have we don't need majorettes. Other countries have sports, no majorettes. But I had to write this book about the culture, not the game, the culture. The game's kind of incidental. But poor Sebastian the ibis was once chased by a bunch of drunken FSU fans in Tallahassee and kind of pushed up against the wall. And the cops had to come rescue him. And we're talking about the human in the ibis suit, not an actual ibis. He's got a little hat on. And I'm like, oh, you poor bird. On the other hand, you're Miami, so, I mean, the hatred, the weird football hatreds, totally irrational. FSU versus Miami, FSU versus the University of Florida. There are loads of them. There's lots of totally irrational hatred. And if y'all know anything about, you might lead clean lives and know nothing about this, but FSU and the University of Florida, they hate each other. And yet the universities look just alike. Gainesville and Tallahassee are both in North Florida, both covered in live oaks. If you were dropped in one from the other, you might not be able to tell the difference. But we're convinced there's a difference. This is why the book is called Tribal. The difference is that your village is full of beautiful, sweet, pure people, and the ones in the next village are werewolves and witches.
I'm laughing at the idea that you have to explain this to someone because it's just so part of my culture.
I'm figuring there are civilized
and
people here.
you're explaining it like it's some adventurous, like, we've never been there before. Like someone has dropped out of outer space and you're explaining to them the feud between Florida and FSU.
There are people that don't, they come to Florida. That's not why they're here,
Thank goodness.
I know. I'm glad you're shocked at that.
But do you think that one of the characteristics of Florida books is an awareness of the absurd, but also an ability to laugh at the dark moments, maybe?
I think a characteristic of Florida books might be that the absurd is treated as if it were not. Like that perception of it as absurdity comes from the outside. Mm-hmm. And I used to think it was something that was very specific to Miami, and then I lived in Tallahassee for a while. In fact, this panel is a really nice sort of homecoming because Diane and I were colleagues at Florida State, and she was my faculty mentor at my very first teaching position. So I sort of blame you for having to write nonfiction in my mind.
Yeah.
So her journalism was such
Poisoning the
inspiration.
minds of the young. That's my job.
But yeah, there's that sense of what just feels like a story or an anecdote is sort of perceived as really wild. I had an experience in college once of writing. We were asked to write a scene. This is a great writing exercise for any of the educators in the audience. We were asked to write a scene that had become a famous family story for which you were not present, and then write it as if you were present for that scene. So it can be infamous, not infamous, but it can, some sort of family story that gets told over and over again, but you weren't there for it, so put yourself in it. What does it look like? Really get all the sensory details in there. And so I wrote about this funeral that had happened that I wasn't allowed to go to. It was a family funeral, but without getting too much into the kind of family I'm from, there was concern about antics that might happen. So I just wrote about it as if I had been allowed to go because everybody talked about this funeral for decades as the most wild time. And my professor, who was a Latina woman, was cracking up while it was happening, but everybody else in the workshop who was not was really horrified and was just sitting there I'm so sorry that happened. And I was like, no, this is a funeral. Have you ever been to a funeral? Sometimes people crawl into caskets and try to make out with the corpse. That doesn't happen. Anyways, I ended up developing that into a short story years later. It's in my first book. It's called Destino Hauling is the story. But I think that's that reaction, right? When the work becomes, when people see the work and they're just reacting in a totally different way than you experienced it. I would like to say, though, I think, and this is not to say that Florida isn't a special and like wildly wonderful place, but a lot of the differences that we see within the state, all these different versions, they sort of replicate themselves in other states as well in different ways. And a lot of that is that sort of like maybe a rural divide versus an urban, rural versus urban, like, and, thinking about the football culture and seeing that in other states and how that's played out. I think of it as Florida is just like a little ahead of the curve on everything. Everybody's sort of, I don't know. I know this panel is called The Last Word, but I do have this temptation to say, like, the reason that Florida gets the hate that it does is that people are just really jealous of our weather, and yeah, that's it. There's a sense of like that we just do it big and we do it outside, and so it's just more visible. And up in other parts of the country, they're inside because it's cold, and so we don't know what's going on in the same ways. Probably not a really elegant theory, but I just kind of feel that.
Yeah, when we're going to have screwed up politics, we're really going big.
Yeah, we just do it big.
I mean, we ruined a presidential election. We're like, yeah, you try that. Georgia, pitiful effort.
Yeah. We laugh because we can't
so the
cry.
mystique of Florida goes back to us being a little full of ourselves?
Full of ourselves,
or
maybe?
Aware of our greatness.
Aware of all of it. There's just, an awareness
aware of our
it.
greatness and worried that we're actually a huge roiling mess.
Aware that we're actually a huge roiling mess.
I mean,
I think
Florida,
we have both. We have both.
We're the state as a metaphor for the rest of the nation, right? And that makes us the most literary state.
I mean,
we're a metaphor.
It is. And if you think of why we're called Florida, pro tip, that's not a native name. Juan Ponce de Leon, in the first sort of instance of advertising, shows up. He wasn't looking for the Fountain of Youth, no matter what you may have heard. That was something put in a biography of him written 100 years after, and it sounded good. But he called the land after Easter flowers, and he thought this will be paradise. And then he had a whole lot of fairly hostile Timucua people shooting at him arrows and got him in the leg. But, he still went and said, we've got to colonize this place. It's wonderful. I'm sure they'll calm down eventually, as we colonize them. And we have been making up Florida ever since. And I'm not saying that as a criticism. I think it's great. I think in a way we're all engaged in a large artistic project to make up different Floridas, to make up Floridas that can contain Jeff Vandermeer's Area X, which, we in North Florida keep hoping will make people not move there. If they're scared to death of encountering an alligator with a human voice or a dolphin with human eyes, maybe I'll freak people out. But, we make these places in our heads. I mean, where I'm from, the planters came down with Andrew Jackson, who wasn't a nice man, we say, and stole land. But then they tried to create a fiction of either sort of Scottish castles. They named all their houses after things in the novels of Sir Walter Scott, who no one reads now, and there's a reason for that. I double dog dare you to try to get through his sentences. Or they wanted to build them to look like Greek temples to show how cultivated they were while they were enslaving people and murdering Seminoles. So, this is a made-up Florida. We try to turn something that's not a garden into a garden as we imagine it, but it is a garden, and it always was. It just wasn't the garden of Sir Walter Scott.
So I want to give you some etymology really quick, not entomology, no bugs, but the word for paradise is related to the word for wall. So when we're talking about paradise, we're talking about something that is walled off.
It's Persian. It's Persian, yes. And it means a walled garden.
Yeah,
Paradise
so-
is a walled garden.
So that's a story itself that we're ascribing to all of this. So what is paradise without our walls? What is paradise without our gaze of having gotten here and started to tell the stories, either to get people to come and cultivate whatever we're growing, or to stay away because, we're having a miserable time here.
I mean, we think about how we make Florida look more Florida somehow because we have it in our heads that this is what Florida should look like. No, there are so many Floridas, but we want it to be the one that's our one in our head, so that we say, right, well, mine is this one and yours is peculiar. It's more tribalism. And we do things like, I don't know how many of you know about the Cross Florida Barge Canal. This was a strange idea to kind of cut a big ditch into the middle of the state. The Spanish actually started it centuries ago, didn't get far, and the thing still didn't get finished, but it's this it was the destruction of a river in order to promote commerce, but also make Florida modern. This idea of making it modern, making it, we have the ugliest Capitol in America, Capitol building in Tallahassee, because it came from.
Ugly.
It is ugly. God, it's ugly. Okay. It's an embarrassment. Because we had a really good progressive governor who wanted the association of Florida to be with the modern world and not with things that had white columns on them all the time. And so his impulse was good and his architect sucked. Jennine, you should pitch us something tough.
Like a hard question? I don't know.
Pitch yourself one.
Why are we here?
Well, then I'll ask you one. I will ask you because
how are we doing on time is actually the real question I have, because we didn't.
I'm assuming someone will come and wave frantically.
I hope so.
At us.
It's the last panel, so they're like, you just go till you're done.
Okay, I'll tell you a thing I wonder about with you, Jennine, in particular, because there you are, a splendid product of South Florida, and then you land at Florida State in, the strange land of young women walking around in hoop skirts, which I remember you being appalled by.
No, I mean, it was just like a perpetual quinceañera for me. I had my own hoop skirt at age, 14, turning 15, went to the ruins of Coral Gables, took a bunch of pictures with Sancho, who had done the photos for my parents' wedding. And then also my quinceañera photos. So,
but it means something different.
It does.
There,
it does.
Which is the issue. Yeah.
I mean, this might be a controversial statement, but I remember landing there and being like, "This isn't Florida. This is South Georgia." And I drove to Miami a lot. I think maybe one weekend a month. I was at least, and then my parents would come up and they loved it. They loved North Florida because they were like, it's so calm here. And there's trees, there's like big trees and shade, and they really enjoyed it. They thought it was they were always talking about it's like super calm here. It's just so nice. There's not traffic. They thought it was like the country, coming out to the country, and they loved my house. And my dad would like sit in the backyard and smoke cigars and cough a lot because that wasn't something he did a lot. So he was kind of playing a part too. But yeah, that was my experience of it, was feeling that it was very different, which then was very different from my experience in the classroom, where at the time, 18% of the undergraduate population was Latinx, and there was also a huge, I remember I knew I was in a place where I was like familiar with the students and sort of how they'd grown up, when there was like a certain class that would happen after a weekend in March, and all my students were just like green and like gray and like super messed up looking. And I was like, was it Ultra Fest this weekend? And they were like, yeah, we were all at Ultra. And I was like, it's, which is like the crazy music festival that happens in Miami where everyone's participating in a lot of activities. And so I knew they'd all come, and I was like, oh, in the future, this will be like, a rest day. We'll do some in-class writing. We'll do some, but no heavy lifting, no reading. Like, no one had done the reading. And I was like, okay, I know, there were certain assumptions I could make about my students based on that. So that part felt always like home, like being in the classroom always felt like home. And it was a wonderful space because often we were talking about the different versions of Florida that many of the students came from, and and then the students from Georgia and surrounding areas all thought Florida was just full of insanity, and we were like feelings mutual.
We embraced it.
Yeah.
We when you're known as a spring break mecca, that's gonna happen. The youngins come down and go, my parents can't see me. I can have 45 beers and pass out on the beach in Panama City, and the only guy that'll care is a cop.
I don't know. There's photographic evidence of everything now.
You're right, because your friends will take a picture of you passed out.
Yeah.
And then put it on social media, and then your parents will have a word with you.
And your mother is an investigative sleuth herself and can find every picture you've ever been in.
Ooh. Yeah. I've noticed that our Q&A folks have moved out into the crowd with the microphones. If
Might be a
anyone would
hint.
like to ask us questions.
It's entirely up to you if you want to start taking them now.
Yeah. Oh, was I not supposed to say that?
No, that's fine.
I don't know what is happening.
Well,
Did you guys want to not do Q&A? Yeah.
no, we do. I
let's
do.
do it.
All right.
You're okay
Let's
with that?
go, yeah.
Rebecca? Yeah.
We can transition to that. Not that guy though. Don't let that guy ask any question. No, it's all right. What's up?
We'll start here.
Scott.
Hey, thank you. Hashtag justice for Sebastian. Jennine, I had a question about your research that you did for your newest novel. You said you were doing some research in Miami, but what kinds of research was it? Were you interviewing people? Were you like going back to places that you hadn't been to in a while that you wanted to set the novel there? Just curious about that process in general.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think with the nonfiction folks on the panel, they can also speak to how they function with research. I got lucky. It's a novel, right? And it's decidedly fiction. And so it was more about places where I felt that the details, I wanted to make sure that whatever details I'd included that support the story or support the narrative were accurate, and that it wasn't going to pull a reader out of the dream of the book. So some of it was visiting places. I will say the main research I did was, there's a chapter on the Dade County Youth Fair. It's where the main character goes on a date, but he doesn't know it's a date. And I hadn't been there since, well, actually, I was like there in 2018, but I wanted to make sure that I had the names of the rides right, and so the bulk of my research was like watching YouTube videos of people at the fair walking around, and I wanted to make sure the food, it changes every year, and I just didn't, I just imagined that like guy who was like at the Q&A at Books and Books in 2 months being like, I was at the fair and that ride was not called that, and it was called this, and I was like, let's think a little bit. So I think there was that person was in my head who was going to be like the super sleuth. So I was watching a lot of those videos and not so much interviewing folks. The bulk of the research too, aside from some of the Miami stuff, was one of the narrators or forces in the book. The narrative forces in the book is Lolita, the captive orca that we recently lost, who passed away at the Miami Seaquarium. And there was so much about orca husbandry and captivity that I needed to read and learn about. And yeah, that was the bulk of it. So reading a lot of books. I also read and highly recommend a book called Disposable City by Mario, is it Ariza is the last name? Yeah, Mario Alejandro Ariza, which just sort of talks about the ways that capitalism and environmental issues and the city of Miami are being discussed in places that we're not privy to. And yeah, that book was huge for me to be able to sort of understand, even just like where, a big part of the book is about king tide and flooding in the city. That's a force, it's a narrative force, literally the water moving through the book in that way. And I needed to just make sure that the neighborhoods that I was saying were flooding as much as I thought they were. And so some of that was just like calling my sister. And I was like, is Miami Shores as bad as, and she's like, oh yeah, I can't, my septic tank keeps failing because water keeps like flooding it. And I was like, okay, cool. I just wanted to make sure that was accurate. So I got lucky. Being from a place meant a lot of that stuff could be anecdotal. But yeah, mostly just confirming the things I already thought and fact-checking a couple things. Did you guys want to speak, if you'd like to speak about how research impacted your work and how you went about it?
I think that's a very interesting process, and I like hearing that you're really going all the way with it, because I think, I don't want to like generalize, but I think a lot of the time, or sometimes, fiction writers go, oh, this is fiction, I can do whatever I want. But I think sometimes readers want fiction to be, like they give fiction a heavier burden of things being plausible and things being true. And I think that readers will fact check fiction more frequently than they'll fact check nonfiction. And then nonfiction, they're like, this is nonfiction, I believe you. And I'm thankful for that, because I do put in a lot of legwork to do it, and I did go into the Everglades and talk to all sorts of people and conduct many interviews and read. I'm thankful that many of the documents I read were digitized, because I would have been swimming in them. I read so many of them. But I also write fiction, and one of the projects I'm working on, I am using journalistic elements, and I think I'm a little addicted to it, though, because it's so much fun to have those aha moments where you see what's really true, and I think it'll give it texture. Like, I think your book sounds like it'll have this great texture and realness to it, and it'll be a little waterlogged, but that's definitely realness here.
That's a Florida thing.
But you're a veteran nonfiction writer, so tell me about how you...
Charming way to say elderly.
Yes.
I started my writing life as both a journalist and an academic. I was always a journalist because I got attention. It's a terrible thing to say, but I wrote columns where the research, it was about Florida government. My research was actually reporting from what I saw in the Florida legislature, and then calling up people that knew a whole lot more than me and saying, can this be true? And then I learned to read bills and read briefs and all that kind of stuff. But I was also learning to be an academic and researching in libraries and looking at old books and old papers. And I still look at old books and old papers because you find the most astonishing things. You come across things, you're looking for one thing, and then you go down the rabbit hole of the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. But, you know, in journalism, editors would always say to you, and they don't care that it's a cliche, you know, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. So you check it out. If you think you know something, or your grandmother said this, and so it must be true, and it might be. But you try to find the papers on it. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes you just can't. But I think reading history, learning about the history of a place, doing cultural archaeology in a way, finding out, okay, I want to write about this place. I see what's here now, what was here before that, and before that, and before that, and getting the receipts and figuring it out. I mean, I know scholars who have done amazing things like, you know, find a lost Shakespeare sonnet. And I'm not doing that. If I accidentally did, good for me, but that's not really what I do. What I do is try to understand the world that, I mean, it sounds incredibly solipsistic, but the world that made me, because I'm not alone in that world. I need to understand why I'm like this, why my world is like this, why my state and my country are the way they are. This is an obsession that never leaves me, and I will never get to the bottom of it, but I'll keep trying.
We have a question in the front.
Hello, and thank you all for bringing us home in the best of ways. So if you watch a government meeting in the Keys, which I have watched, I don't want to think about how many, a lot of people will introduce themselves and establish their bona fides by talking about how long they've been here. And that could be 5 years or it could be 5 generations, but it's the first thing they say about themselves. And I guess I have 2 questions. I mean, I have some theories about why that is. I'd like to hear yours. And do they do this in other places in Florida?
They do it in other places. But I think the place it's coming from is asserting an investment in what's going on. I don't think it's about one-upping anybody. It's saying, you know, like, I'm Bob whoever, and I mean business because I know what I'm talking about, and it matters to me. And so it should matter to you, too. That's my take on that.
I think that people often do that exactly to establish authority that they may or may not have. But I think it's also a way to say, especially if you say, I've lived on What's It Road for 55 years and, you know, we never had potholes before, and now we have potholes. So it's you new people that are making the potholes somehow mysteriously. So it's this idea that, you know, here was the thing, and changes have happened, and I don't like them. But it's a thing that happens a lot too, to, I think, sometimes make either people who've been here longer or people who haven't feel terrible because whatever you did was wrong. You know, you just got here, so you don't know how things work, or you've been here so long you don't know how the modern world works. And I think it's just humans establishing their territory, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with both those answers. I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of it. I think it's really generous, your interpretation of it.
I think we're imagining very different people.
Maybe,
I'm
yeah.
imagining some guy like getting up there to stump to save an oak tree, and you're like some crank talking about potholes.
I guess I live in Tallahassee where, yes, we try to save oak trees, but then somebody else gets up and says, but it's too close to the road, you know.
Yeah.
So
Move
I
the
know
road.
it's dumb, but
Yeah, I guess the person I'm imagining is someone who like comes into the city and is like, I want to bring this here. And then they're like, you're not from here. You don't get to do that. You don't know what we need. But oftentimes it is that, you know, we've heard this over and over again in this conference, that sense of leaving and coming back and having that bit of an outsider's view allows you to, in some ways, even see more deeply inside. So, you know, it takes a range of people and their experiences. We can talk later, Nancy, but I'm just curious about like what your theory is about why people do that. So please share later or now.
And
if you want.
my suspicion is that government meetings in the Keys have many, many other spokes to their little wheels, where, you know, I mean, this is one of the few places where there's probably a pro and anti-chicken lobby. You know, a lot of places we don't have enough chickens for people to fuss about.
I did hear on the ride over here, so the driver was like, now the chickens are protected. 2 years ago, we tried to get rid of them all, but now they're protected. And then I think about how in Little Havana, the chickens are like, let's make a big fake chicken and put it outside the restaurant so that everybody knows that was here.
Chicken
you know?
heritage. Well, a friend of mine and I went today to the Hemingway house, not because we cared particularly. This is shocking for an English professor. We didn't care that much about Hemingway. We went to see the cats, and one of the tour guides was saying, these cats are federally protected because technically they're all members of the United States Navy. And of course, everyone's going, what? And it's because the first polydactyl cat, who I believe was called Snowball, that was given to Ernest Hemingway, was a Navy cat, a ship cat. And therefore, Snowball's descendants are all somehow in the United States Navy. Just an idea that makes me very happy.
Sebastian the ibis is technically in the Merchant Marine. So
All right,
it's a long
then.
tradition of Florida birds in the service.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, thanks for speaking. I was struck by how self-deprecating you each are about your appropriate sections of Florida, and we don't do that in the Keys. We're very protective of. We think this is the center of the universe, so we never say anything negative about it. Diane, one thing about your territory that struck me, I've traveled all over Florida, and if you go to the grocery store in North Florida, you'll see couples shopping for their groceries, and the wife will be decked in jewels and dressed like she's going to the opera or something, and her husband will be wearing a baseball cap, driving a pickup truck, look like he just got off a tractor or something, working on a farm, and they just seem like the most unlikely couple. Is that fodder for anything? Is that, you recognize that, or?
I can't say that I've noticed that. I wish I had.
Okay.
I go to grocery stores all the time. I mean, there's food in there. But what I've seen that in St. Petersburg. When I lived in St. Petersburg in Old Northeast, there would be these ladies with the most beautiful designer clothes and handbags and jewels, and then there would be this guy who looked like, I don't know what, kind of like you described. But I think, the richness of the world means that I just didn't happen to see these people, and I'm glad that you did, and now I'm going to think about it. But, because Tallahassee is it also thinks it's the center of the universe, very much so, or the center of the Floridaverse. And it isn't, but we think it is because it's the capital. And, there are so many people who have so many rules which are designed to make them feel like they're in the best tribe, the best group, and the other people are not quite it. And a lot of it has to do with defining ourselves very aggressively as Southern. So Southerners are all manners fetishists, and we notice if somebody does something absolutely criminal, shockingly criminal, like wear white shoes after Labor Day. I mean, that's just. Any of y'all seen the movie Serial Mom? It's a John Waters movie. The main character kills somebody for doing that. And she has a good explanation of why, too.
I thought the question was going to say, when you mentioned grocery stores in North Florida, I thought it was like, I walked in there and I saw, and for some reason I really was positive you were going to say pimento cheese. Because that's there.
Yes.
And that's wonderful. And my last word on Florida will be pimento cheese. No, but keeping that conversation going. Yeah, I just thought you were going to say pimento cheese.
Yeah, we haven't even talked about food. What a shame. We won't now.
Yeah.
But you could come and ask us stuff while we're all sitting there signing books, because we can't get away. The table's against the wall.
I did find a restaurant with alligator chili.
Oh, now it's a good one.
So I didn't get it because I wasn't feeling alligator
here?
yesterday. Yeah.
Wow. I've had rattlesnake, but it's not very interesting.
This is the most Florida conversation ever. What strange animal have you put in your mouth?
Okay, possum. I'm just going to say possum. Do y'all have possums here? Okay.
Are they delicious?
Oh, no,
I
they're
don't
horrible. There is a tiny, tiny town in Washington County called Wausau, Wausau, and they have a possum festival. Because all the other towns got the good stuff, watermelons, peanuts, cotton, corn, whatever.
They just wanted to play dead.
Yeah.
They did, except they have a statue of a possum doing something a possum cannot do. It's a possum rampant. And their theory is, their claim is that the possum helped it's very rural, very poor people stay alive during the Depression. I think this is nonsense. That part might be true. So they have a contest. Prettiest possum, what a concept there. Ugliest possum, seems more rational. But then they also, this is horrible, they make possum stew, which is vile. I mean, it's greasy and dreadful, and But if you go to it, they make you eat this at the festivals. You just have to. Politicians go there to give stump speeches, or they used to. And then they'd be forced to hold a possum and eat possum, often at the same time.
New bucket list item for everyone.
Yeah.
I
Don't
draw
say
the
you
line at
weren't warned.
alligator.
I agree with you.
I think we're done because they
Yes.
have one more question.
Stop us
Alligator
before we
should be
talk
the last
again.
word.
Yeah.
Thank you all
Thank you
so
all so
much.
much. Yeah.
Thank you.